Welcome back, everyone, to our symposium on the athlete in the arena, Theodore Roosevelt and the development of American sporting life. We're glad you're here. For those who are watching us on streaming around the country and around the world, welcome back. We have an exciting afternoon. We're going to go for the next 2 hours here. And let me just explain. First, Ryan Swanson is going to give his lecture. And I think you're going to find it really extraordinary based on his book, The Strenuous Life. But then we have a coaches panel. We have 4 local coaches, and here's why. When we created this theme, athletes, we thought, well, here's a chance to bring in people from the community, from the university community, student athletes, the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, coaches in the community, to talk about leadership, character building, coaching, possibly Roosevelt. And so there'll be 4 of them. And that will be right after Ryan's talk. But this is a chance to sort of see, the phrase is quid ad nos. What does this have to do with us? So you saw this morning that Roosevelt's view of sport has almost entirely been violated in every possible way by the commercialization of American sport and the professionalization of collegiate sport. You would think that a man of his stature would have had more influence on the history of American sport than he has had, but those remarks that Simon Cordery put up from Roosevelt quotations on the subject were really chilling to me, to think of how dramatically we have veered from that late 19th, early 20th century notion of the building of character through intramural sport, or competitive but not obsessively competitive, that sport was an interlude in one's life, lifelong avocation, but not something that you necessarily were going to professionalize. The belief that character and moral development are much more important than just winning. And I think our coaches this afternoon will be able to put that into some really interesting perspectives, so stay tuned for that. For now, our TR Honors Leadership Program Director, Niles Hike, is here to introduce Ryan Swanson. Niles.
Thank you, everyone. I'm excited to introduce Dr. Ryan Swanson, and I'm also excited to have him sign this book. On behalf of Dickinson State University, the TR Foundation, and Dickinson, we'd like to welcome Dr. Ryan Swanson. Dr. Swanson was kind enough to offer his time to speak to my intro to the TRHLP course earlier this week. He spoke to our newest group of TR scholars on how leadership programs, such as those he himself directs, can benefit students and communities everywhere. Dr. Swanson also helped me coordinate a meaningful class discussion on how people can use their hobbies to serve others. He piqued my students' curiosity on the subject of service learning, and I'm sure he'll do the same thing here as he speaks on the life of Theodore Roosevelt. Just a quick bit about me before we introduce Dr. Swanson. I am a proud North Dakotan, someone born and raised here in Dickinson. I grew up walking Medora and the Badlands. Hopefully you've had a chance to take a look at the Badlands. I'm also a proud Blue Hawk and TR scholar. As a 2003 Theodore Roosevelt Honors graduate, I had the privilege, as do all our current TR scholars, of drawing inspiration from Roosevelt. I often thought him to be a bulldozer kind of man. He attacked everything with such earnestness. This model taught me how to work and grow in life. I'm always thankful for Roosevelt's model on leading and living. My wish is that it will serve as a model for our next generation. We have heard so many wise words on Roosevelt this weekend. I hope we all have taken away a new message on life. That's one of the foremost values of attending these kinds of events. I hope the students especially have found a message on life that will help them continue their path of excellence. The message I took from this weekend's many great presentations on Roosevelt is not to waste a single moment in life. I want to specifically speak to our younger generation. Don't waste a single minute of your day. Attack life with the same spirit that Roosevelt did. You don't need to scroll mindlessly through social media and look at yet another silly video. Buy a Kindle and start reading. Roosevelt was himself an avid reader and writer. as well as a bulldozer kind of athlete. Undertake pursuits that matter and attack them with earnestness throughout your day. Now, to best introduce Dr. Swanson, I gave him some questions that he could answer. The first set of questions, why history? Where can people find value in their own lives from learning more about key figures such as Theodore Roosevelt? Dr. Swanson explains, I've always loved the stories. I started out pre-med in college, planning to pursue a practical degree, but I eventually just decided to go with my passion. I think people can definitely find comfort and perspective in studying the past. People are people. It's amazing how similar some of the anxieties and worries are to those of the past. As the saying goes, there is nothing new under the sun. The second set of questions, what's a fact about Theodore Roosevelt that speaks to you personally? Dr. Swanson shares my favorite TR anecdote. It's the fact that he tortured White House visitors with unexpected tennis matches, as we learned about last night, in the August heat. I appreciate his willingness to bend conventions and find fun in the midst of a presidential schedule. Let's welcome Dr. Swanson.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, Niles. And let me start out with a couple of thank yous, if that's okay. I'd like to thank, in no particular order, Clay and Sharon and Stacy and Mary and Chris and their team for allowing me the chance to speak with you today. It was back in 2015, I think, when I came here to Dickinson, North Dakota with just the beginnings of a book in mind. And I came to this conference, and I sat here in the audience, and I was overwhelmed by the situation. For the first time, I got to go to the Badlands, and I listened to people talk about TR and how much they love TR, and then Theodore Roosevelt himself got up and asked a question, right? And so it's a dream come true for me to be back here today to speak with you. And so we just had lunch, and these seats are warm. So to get your attention, I'd like to start off with a confession, a scintillating, maybe scandalous confession. And here it is. I love sports documentaries. Like, love them, okay? And my kids can attest to this. I love sports documentaries, and I love the stories that are told. I love the fact that we are in a golden age of sports documentaries right now. And you can ask my kids. My oldest son came in not too long ago when I was watching part 7 of the Derek Jeter documentary that's out right now. Loved it, and I hate the Yankees. And so, I saw an opportunity. I said, Carter, he's 17, he's a senior in high school, and I tried to draw him in, to get him to watch with me. And he held up his hand, said, Dad, let me guess, you're watching some show on some guy who played on some team in some game a long time ago. What do high schoolers know anyway, right? And so we are living, I think, in the golden age of sports documentaries. And I think we're living in a time when people are telling stories about the past through sports better than they've ever done before. And so that's what I'd like to do today, tell you some stories about the past using sports. And so I think the golden age of sports documentaries really started in 2009 with ESPN's 30 for 30 series. And let me pull the audience here for a second. How many of you have seen a 30 for 30 documentary? All right, call out some of the ones that you have seen, the topics, if you will.
I hate Christian Laettner.
I hate Christian Laettner. I don't hate Christian Laettner, but I hear you. What else? John Daly, okay, yeah. Others?
When the Garden Was Eden.
When the Garden Was Eden, yeah. So these sports documentaries started out with what I see as a really interesting rhetorical device. They often start out with this question, or this phrase right here. What if I told you? And so if it's okay with you, to get us kind of rolling today, I'd like to start out with some what if I told yous as we go forward. What if I told you that TR was never a champion, but he had a really interesting athletic odyssey. What if I told you that Theodore Roosevelt sometimes confused war and sports? What if I told you that TR had some of the same terrible tendencies as that crazy soccer mom or feisty t-ball dad that you've seen on the sidelines? What if I told you that Theodore Roosevelt didn't actually save football? What if I told you that Theodore Roosevelt was blinded while boxing in one eye at the White House? What if I told you, and you already know this one, that TR subjected his White House guests to tennis in the swampy heat of August? What if I told you that Theodore Roosevelt understood the political hazard that is golf? What if I told you that Theodore Roosevelt was not nearly good enough to play football at Harvard, but that he really wished he was? What if I told you that Theodore Roosevelt was infuriated when sparring partners were brought into the White House and they refused to hit him with all of their strength? What if I told you that Theodore Roosevelt hated baseball? What if, right? So those are some sub questions that I want you to think about, and I'm running hot today. Some sub questions, but here's the big overall question that I'd like you to think about. What if one of Theodore Roosevelt's greatest contributions to American culture was his willingness to struggle publicly with his physical limitations? All right, what if? This is what I want to talk about today when we talk about Roosevelt and sports and the strenuous life. Because Theodore Roosevelt is a man who is good at so many things, right? Theodore Roosevelt is a man who wrote 38 books, 40 books? How many do we have?
That's how you count. Say 40.
40. Theodore Roosevelt wrote 40 books. He served as President of the United States. He won the Nobel Peace Prize. He married 2 beautiful women, not at the same time. He had 6 children. All those things were going for him, but he really struggled with his physical limitations. Athletics were always a struggle. All right? Theodore Roosevelt couldn't see very well. He had terrible asthma, and he struggled with his weight for his whole life. As you can see, he was basically twice the man in adulthood that he was as a younger man. So that's what I want to talk about today. Theodore Roosevelt had every reason to avoid sports. He was, as he would tell several men, never a champion, but he always kept at it. From his teen years until his death, he participated in, he pontificated about, and he promoted sports. So let me ask you again this question. What if one of Theodore Roosevelt's greatest contributions was his willingness to struggle publicly with this weakness? All right, that's the strenuous life I'd like to talk about. To Theodore Roosevelt, the strenuous life was a call, among other things, for broad participation in athletics. All right, we've already heard this, right? It's not about going to watch sports, it's about participating in sports. Now, I'm a sports historian, so it would be remiss if I didn't stop here at the beginning and talk a little bit about the fact that during the Roosevelt era, many important firsts happened in the sports world. And as my colleagues have laid out, there's a lot going on here. This is not Roosevelt creating sports, but rather serving as an embodiment of, an encouragement of sports development. So during the Roosevelt presidency, interscholastic athletics are really entrenched. The Pacific Schools Athletic League in New York City starts in 1903, and what happens in New York City tends to spread in other directions, right? The first time the Olympics are held in the United States is 1904. And Roosevelt does play a role in the Olympics. He's the honorary chairman of the Olympic Games in 1904. He hosts the U.S. Olympic team at his house in 1908. All right, so he plays a role there. Roosevelt is also president when the NCAA begins coming together. All right, it's not called that then, but he's the beginning of that as well. Roosevelt is also a purveyor of pedestrianism or jogging. I think we would think of it today as jogging or hiking, that kind of thing. So in addition to that, Roosevelt's also president when the first World Series hits in 1903. He doesn't like baseball. He sees baseball as overly professional, connected to gambling, but nevertheless, he's president then. So these are all accomplishments and precedents and all of those things going on, but I don't think this is as important as the tone that he set. So I want to talk tone, I want to talk stories more than I want to talk particulars, because I think we've had the table set for us in that way. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Look at this cute little guy. All right, this is Roosevelt, born 1858. The Civil War is coming at this time. He's born in New York City. The Roosevelt family has interests in all kinds of things. He is born in New York City to a New York rich family. The family has interests in real estate and glass. And so, and don't overhear me here on this point, Roosevelt has more in common probably with President Trump than he does with his hero, Abraham Lincoln, in terms of his beginnings, right? Starts from a position of wealth and privilege. The family travels extensively throughout Europe and the Middle East. They are politically connected, socially respected. Roosevelt has it all, for the most part. He would have had an ideal childhood except for the fact that around age 3, and you probably have already heard this, he begins really struggling with asthma. And I won't ask how many of you have had asthma here. I have not. But what I would caution you to do is not think about Roosevelt's asthma necessarily in terms of the way maybe you saw it experienced with a friend in PE class. This is not, a discomfort where he's got to step aside, get his inhaler, and then he can go back and play. No, for Roosevelt, from about age 3 until 12 or 13, it is a crisis on a daily basis, okay? So for Roosevelt, his asthma is so bad that he cannot participate in school. He cannot run around the neighborhood, if you will, with his friends. And maybe making things even worse is the fact that in the 1860s, when Roosevelt is struggling with asthma, asthma is viewed very much as something that, yes, is physical, but also is mental and is moral. And so for Roosevelt to suffer with asthma at this time, there are real questions about whether he's conjuring it up. And so one of the beliefs at the time is that children use asthma to get out of going to school, get out of going to church, get out of doing something like that. Interestingly enough, scholars, including Tweed Roosevelt, have really undertaken an analysis of asthma and what it did and didn't do in Roosevelt's life. This is an article that was published in 2015, which takes on the idea of asthma being psychosomatic, conjured up mentally. And I think this is a really interesting article. And what it shows is the fact that Roosevelt's asthmatic episodes, the fact that they occurred primarily on Fridays and Saturdays and Sundays, isn't a fact of him conjuring them up over the weekend. It's actually the way that crises tend to happen. That's just kind of paraphrasing it. So if you look at the numbers here, this article points out that the fact that Roosevelt seems to have this propensity to have these attacks on, Monday and Saturday and Sunday fits with the way that people go to emergency rooms, all right? And the article is much more complicated than that and much more beneficial than that, but I just wanted to kind of point it out as an example of thinking about what asthma does in a child's life. Okay, so the family tries everything to help Roosevelt with this asthmatic condition that he suffers from. They have him do things like ingest Ipecac. They have him do bloodletting. They have him subjected to shock treatment. And then think of that cute little guy right there. They have him smoking cigars. They have him going out in the winter night trying to get some relief from the icy cold air. And this makes sense. There's an inflammation going on of the air pathways, right? And so they have him doing that. And interestingly, anybody know what they settle in on, or Roosevelt kind of thinks is the best relief for asthma? Coffee. Yeah, his lifelong addiction, right? Roosevelt thinks coffee's as good as anything. And so for Roosevelt, it is the overriding issue of his childhood, asthma, physical inability to breathe. So this is the starting point for Roosevelt, the athlete. Now, as has already been laid out by a couple of our other scholars, at age about 13, 12 or 13, Roosevelt is called into the office by his father, Thee, and he calls him in for a heart-to-heart. And I'm going to paraphrase here. You've seen some of the words already. Basically, his dad says, though, enough. We can't continue to live like this anymore. I'm proud of you, son, he says, among other things. You're smart, he says. You have the mind, but you have to make your body. All right? Now, is this fair? Not really. Not really. I'm a father, right? I rarely tell my kids to go fix their illness. But But according to Roosevelt's memory and his sister's memory of this occurrence, Roosevelt stops and thinks about it for a minute. The way I see it, he probably had these images flashing through his mind, remembering the embarrassment that came with having to cancel certain events and certain trips because he had an asthmatic attack. That was embarrassing to him. He probably remembers the panic of some of the times when he just can't breathe. So he thinks about all of that. His father's issued this challenge. And at that point, he kicks his head back and says, okay, I'll do it. I'll make my body. And if we could, I would cue up the Rocky music. Because basically, this is the beginning of Roosevelt going on this athletic journey. I'm going to train. I'm going to become strong. I'm going to become an athlete. I'm going to cure myself. I'm going to make my body. So, again, don't miss the starting point. Roosevelt is a boy with asthma, poor vision, small stature, but he wants to become an athlete. He's been challenged by his father, who he respects immensely. So he does it in rich kid fashion to a certain extent. His father builds him something of a gymnasium in the family home. He brings in boxing tutors, champions. So this is not a kid just kind of doing it on his own. He's got a lot of support. And gradually things begin to pick up. He begins to get stronger. He begins to get some confidence. Mostly what he engages in is boxing, wrestling, riding. At one point, as he's getting to his mid-teen years, he decides he establishes a plan to run 1 mile at full speed every day through the woods. Now, physiologically, not the best plan, but you got to appreciate kind of what he's trying to do here, right? I'm going to go all out for a mile. I'm going to push my lungs. I'm going to do that. So gradually things start to get better for him. That's not without some bumps in the road. One of Roosevelt's favorite stories, he talks about being on a train when he's confronted by some bullies. And to tell you the short version of the story, Roosevelt is humiliated because not only do the bullies kind of take him on, but he doesn't even get beat up. He can't even get that far, basically, is what he says. They just kind of suppress him, keep him in his place, and a fight doesn't even happen. So for him, he can't even kind of get to that point. But he continues to train. He continues to work with these boxing tutors. He continues to get stronger. And gradually, Roosevelt begins even winning a few matches. And he talks about one event where he is put in a small boxing tournament in his local gym. I don't know all the details, but the draw was super friendly. He ends up with some pretty light competition, and what happens? He wins his trophy. That is not Roosevelt. We don't have a picture, but he wins. He wins. And he talks about this event in a really touching and honest way. And I'll put the quote up here. He talks about how this trophy becomes one of his most prized possessions. I kept it and alluded to it, and I fear bragged about it for a number of years, and I only wish I knew where it was now. Years later, I read the account of a little man who once, in a fifth-rate handicap rate, won a worthless pewter medal and loved it, or enjoyed in it ever after. Well, as soon as I read that story, I felt that the little man and I were brothers. This was, as far as I remember, the only one of my exceedingly rare triumphs which would be worth relating. Okay? This is Roosevelt the human, in my mind. We recently moved, and I found a box of trophies, just of this ilk. You know, some medals I won, third place in a 5K when I was 9 years old, and those kinds of things. Intellectually, I knew I should throw these away, but some emotional part of me thought, I want to keep these. I want to hold on to these. So Roosevelt had that experience as well. And as he works his way through this, a miracle happens, okay? Roosevelt begins to cease being an asthmatic boy and begins to become a strong young man. And he is convinced of the relationship of what's going on here. I exercised and challenged myself, therefore I cured myself of asthma. Now, that's the connection he makes in his brain. What we know is that it's very common for adolescents to age out of the worst effects of asthma. Okay, so, but for Roosevelt, it doesn't matter. The connection is in place by the time he's in his teen years. Athletics and effort equal development and health. Okay, what we have here, and statistical people could talk about this in greater detail, we have a difference probably in correlation and causation. But for our president moving forward of the United States at this era, he's convinced that there is a correlation. All right, you push yourself and you get better. And so this is why he becomes such an advocate of athletics, among other reasons. So Roosevelt in 1876 goes off to Harvard, many experiences while he's there. He arrives in 1876. Whatever your experience was in college, don't equate it with Roosevelt's. He got a beautiful room, put wallpaper on the wall, got furniture. It was not the cinder block, kind of experience most of us had. And he made up for lost time. Remember, he's the child who can't go out and play, can't go to school. And so what does he do? He joins everything. I would say it's a classic case of FOMO. For those of you who don't use this term, FOMO means fear of missing out. It's popular with the youth of the day, I hear. My wife and I are convinced she's a FOMO person, fear of missing out. She always wants to be engaged. I'm a phobie, fear of being invited. But this is Roosevelt at this time. So he's joining everything, doing everything. Again, he's not good enough to play football. Not good enough to row on Harvard's crew team, which, as Simon pointed out, this is the top of the top, right? This is Division I athletics, if we think of it today. But what he does do is he trains every day, for the most part, in the gymnasium, barbells, wrestling, sparring, boxing, and he works to become competent. And in typical Roosevelt fashion, this is actually from the year before he goes to college, Roosevelt doesn't do anything willy-nilly, right? So he's keeping records, keeping track of what he's doing. And so here you see a measurement. He has one journal in particular in which he keeps track of his athletic achievements. Very Rooseveltian, right? He's not just going to do it. And so on the left here, you see him taking measurements right before he goes into Harvard. And you can see he is a small, fit, strong young man. And so by the time he leaves Harvard, Roosevelt is an athlete. He is up to par at the very least. Not a champion, not on on the athletic teams, but he's come a long way. As he leaves Harvard, and this we've already met this gentleman in a previous talk. As he leaves Harvard, two people kind of shape his pathway out of that institution. First, there's Dudley Sargent, who we heard about before. Dudley Sargent is an assistant professor of physical education at Harvard for a time. He's involved with the YMCA. He is, according to himself and other people, kind of the father of physical education, one of the fathers, along with Luther Gulick and some other people. So Dudley Sargent does a lot of things at Harvard, including manage the gymnasium. This is a time when Harvard isn't really sure it wants to be involved in PE kind of courses. But the thing that I think is most important for Sargent in terms of Roosevelt is Sargent wants data. He wants data about the human body. And so he requires, how do you get things included in the curriculum at a university? Today it requires 7 committees and 17 forms. Sargent maybe got it easier, but he decided that everyone who graduated from Harvard had to have a physical evaluation. And so this is what we heard about before. And so the image of people going through this process involves stripping down completely naked, waiting in the hall with other naked young men, and then going in to see Sargent and having him fill out a form with about 60 blanks where he measured you kind of in the way Roosevelt measured himself, circumference and weight, and then he asked questions and looked into your past. And when Roosevelt was finished with this, he was given, in some ways, kind of a physical fitness death sentence. Sargent told him no more. As we've heard. No more bounding up the stairs, no more going for long runs, no more tossing around the football in the yard. Anything you do at any moment might lead to a heart attack, all right? He's very much thinking of he does one kind of breathing measurement where he finds that the average college man blows about a 30 in terms of lung strength. Roosevelt blows about a 10. And so he's looking at all of this and thinking about his asthma history and saying, no more, all right? You can't do this. So Sargent tells Roosevelt this as he's leaving the institution. Roosevelt will have none of it. Doctor, I'm going to do all the things you tell me not to do. If I've got to live the sort of life you have described, I don't care how short it is. This is somewhat foreboding given the way that Roosevelt's life will play out. But you see kind of this spirit of overcoming still, right? The second individual who's really important at the tail end of Roosevelt's time at Harvard and moving forward, of course, is Alice Lee. They are married just as he is finishing up his time at Harvard. She tragically passes away early in their marriage during childbirth, only a couple of years. This is when Roosevelt comes out to North Dakota to assuage his grief and to find himself here. I do think it's interesting to think about how Roosevelt, the athletic president, might have been different if Alice was his wife moving forward. She was a strong tennis player, a real advocate of physical fitness. She could have, this is rampant speculation here, she could have pushed forward a movement for girls' physical fitness alongside of her husband, perhaps. But we won't ever know. She passes away and Roosevelt remarries Edith, a childhood friend. But these are kind of the voices, the people with Roosevelt as he's finishing up at Harvard. After Harvard, Roosevelt begins rising like a rocket. He enters politics after thinking about law school for a minute. He becomes the police commissioner of New York City, the assistant secretary of the Navy. I'm glossing over things that people write all kinds of books about. He becomes a war hero in the Spanish-American War with the Rough Riders, San Juan Hill. All of those things, which are important, lead to a moment when he articulates the strenuous life. So again, this is years in the coming, but I think is important to note. 1899, Roosevelt has been swept in, as someone else said, swept into the governorship of New York. He's invited to Chicago to give a speech in April. It's a blustery, cold day. And he gives a speech which is mostly about imperialism and foreign policy and American strength. But in it, he coins this term of the strenuous life. Words that we're perhaps familiar with. I wish to preach, not the doctrine of ignoble ease, but the doctrine of the strenuous life. This idea of the strenuous life ceases to be Roosevelt's once he puts it out into the public, right? And the strenuous life means many things, but given Roosevelt's past and development and kind of moving forward with the athletic development of the time, the strenuous life becomes very much linked to Roosevelt and his athletic development. The strenuous life becomes kind of a tagline for the athletic revolution. The strenuous life is powerful then and powerful now. For those of you who drove here, there's still time. You can go to a strenuous life retreat starting, is that Saturday? There are strenuous life medals that you can earn with different groups. A group called the Art of Manliness offers the strenuous life Get Your Life Together program. As I was writing the book, I kept trying to join this as an academic exercise, but it fills up like the moment it opens. And so I would always miss it by like an hour and it would be full. So the strenuous life still reverberates and still means a lot of things to a lot of people, but I think it's tied into athletics. So Roosevelt becomes president, as we know, following an assassination in 1901. And he is a new type of president. One of the first things that Theodore Roosevelt does within the first couple of months in the White House in 1901 is he travels with almost all of his cabinet to the Army-Navy football game. And all kinds of questions surround this visit. People are asking, is it proper for a president to do this? Is it safe, given the assassination which just happened? But he comes to Franklin Field in Philadelphia, which you can see on the right there. And with great pomp and circumstance, the president enters. He sits on the Navy side in the first half, and obviously Roosevelt has naval connections. And then with great ceremony, he gets up and walks across the field and sits on the Army side for the second half. Army wins, and the press, and there's all kinds of coverage of this, the press is not watching the game at all. All they are doing is watching Roosevelt in the stands. And they cannot get over how vigorous he is, how involved he is. He's yelling at the teams, he's yelling at the referees. At one point, he gets up, bounds down the stairs, jumps over a fence, and gets on the Navy sideline. And he's like slapping the guys on the back and telling him to go for it. And people are just amazed at this new type of president and how, again, how close he kind of feels to athletics. This is the footage of him crossing the field, which I'm going to try to play. We'll see if it works. It's not scintillating footage, but so this is halftime. Let's see, I got to skip a little forward. This is from the Library of Congress. Perhaps we have this in the collection here. I'm not sure, but okay, so let's see. So apparently entourages were a thing back then too. You can kind of pick him out there in the front. I don't know who these guys in the back are, but yeah, so This is a tradition which still stands in terms of the president attending the Army-Navy football game and switching sides at half, which I think is kind of interesting. Oops, let's see here. So Roosevelt embarks upon this presidency, which, again, I rifled through kind of the things that are accomplished while Roosevelt is president. The first World Series happens, the Public Schools Athletic League is put in place, America hosts its first Olympic Games, baseball becomes America's national pastime even more with the World Series, the NCAA rises, the tennis cabinet is established. Now, the question I think we should ask is, how much does this have to do with Roosevelt, right? What I am not saying is that Roosevelt somehow created all of these things, started all of these things, but what I am saying is that Roosevelt throws his support behind a movement. He gets directly involved with football, which I'll talk about in a minute, and Roosevelt creates a culture in which these things make sense. Roosevelt talks and writes about making a stronger nation. He constantly shares his own experiences as an athlete. And again, the tennis court is very important to all of this. And we've heard some about this already. But Roosevelt oversees a renovation of the White House in 1902. And in that renovation, a tennis court is put in place. There's a bit of disagreement among historians about exactly how the tennis court got included, but I think it's fair to say that Edith had a hand in it, and whether she just wanted her husband to get more exercise or she thought he was getting a little bit too plump, which she talked about from time to time, wanted him to watch his weight. She had a role in getting this put in place, and I think what's important for us is the proximity, right? And we've seen these images before, but Roosevelt is mere feet from his kind of place of play, his place of competition. The tennis court becomes a cultural touchstone for athletics, and stories are leaked out over and over again about Roosevelt the tennis player, Roosevelt the walker, Roosevelt the sparring partner. Although the press is never allowed to take photos, which is unfortunate for us as historians, we certainly know about these events, and the people of his time knew about these events. One point I make in my book is that Roosevelt is referred to in his first full year in the White House using the term strenuous more than 10,000 times. So what I did was start looking through databases and newspapers to figure out how often that term was used with Roosevelt, and it was used all the time. The press really just, if in doubt, needing some way to describe Roosevelt, talked about him strenuous. He was called a strenuous eater, a strenuous vacationer, a strenuous parent, and then they kind of mess with that word in all different directions, strenuosity and strenuacity and just all these kind of different ways. So that's how the word, the ideas about Roosevelt came out. Roosevelt mostly plays tennis in terms of the sport that he does, but while he's in the White House, he has this tennis cabinet, as Mike told us. He has these people coming and playing. Most of them are a bit younger than he is. Some of them are former college athletes. These men play tennis together, yes, but they also spar together at times. They enjoy competing with single stick, which is kind of like fencing, but with a much heavier implement of fighting. They toss around the medicine ball. They go riding for long periods of time. Roosevelt likes to do that with Edith as well. Roosevelt also spends time using dumbbells. He practices jujitsu, as we saw. And so with this, Roosevelt's creating this image of an active president, which is very different. Now, one part of this whole equation is the fact that Roosevelt gets involved in college football. And so let me talk for a minute about that. Again, mostly I was trying to kind of tell the story of Roosevelt as athlete, but I want to kind of stop here for a minute. College football is extraordinarily popular by by Roosevelt's time of his presidency. In 1905, though, college football has a crisis. It's called the death harvest. Depending on who you ask, and sports historians get really into this stuff, somewhere around 20 people died on the football field during the 1905 season. Or from injuries sustained on the football field. So the game's not only violent and causing injuries, but it's literally leading to deaths. As was mentioned, Roosevelt's own son is among this generation who's experiencing this violent game. Ted at Harvard experienced, and if you step back to Groton, the injuries he experienced over a couple of years playing football. He broke a couple of ribs. He had a concussion. At one point, he got a huge gash on his forehead. His nose was busted up, and then he broke his ankle. And so Roosevelt not only knows about the kind of problems that football is having from a broad standpoint, but he knows about it as a father as well. And then, so at that point, an abolition movement is breaking out. There's a move to get rid of football altogether on the university campus, right? And I think that there's reason to think that this makes sense, right? These are places of education. You now have the maiming of young men, the killing of young men. Is this something universities really want to be involved with? Could be a question for today as well. So Roosevelt gets involved. He believes that the game is a net positive. Interestingly enough, the main proponent of abolishing college football is the president at Roosevelt's own institution, Charles Eliot. Charles Eliot is a very powerful, influential leader in higher education, and he wants Harvard to be done with the game altogether. So with that background, Roosevelt gets pulled into the football debate. And Roosevelt calls for a meeting at the White House of the coaches and administrators, basically, of Harvard, Princeton, and Yale. And so think about this situation. The President of the United States, the Secretary of State, Elihu Root, and football coaches from schools sit around the table. Kind of amazing, right? And for the better part of 2 hours, Roosevelt and these coaches and Secretary of State have a conversation about the game. And they discuss a couple of things. They discuss the violence that's going on. They discuss the rules that are in place. And Roosevelt's actually really concerned about the enforcement of the rules. So one thing I think that Roosevelt's concerned about is not only is the game itself problematic, but is it just that maybe we're not enforcing the way the game is supposed to be played? So he's kind of trying to figure those things out. This is not well received by the people who are attending this. One of them is Walter Camp. And Walter Camp is kind of the forefather of football in some ways. And Camp thinks that Roosevelt is really overstepping. We have built this game to its position of popularity. It's now something that serves institutions and students. And Camp is really put off that the president is getting involved at all. And so after a 2-hour period, more than 2 hours, these guys get back on a train and go home. And on that train, they basically have a discussion about what's the least amount that we can do and say that we haven't ignored the president. Okay, so it is not a situation of trying to come to an agreement. It's how little can we do without getting in trouble with the President of the United States. And so basically they put out a statement saying that we will enforce the rules and we will continue to look at the game. But the presidential weight on that situation leads pretty quickly over the next couple of years to a series of meetings and a series of organizations which will lead to the NCAA. So I would argue that Roosevelt doesn't save football, but he is certainly an advocate of football, and he intervenes in one of football's crises, right? Football has a crisis every 10 years or so. We are in the midst of one not too long ago, CTE, concussions. Is the game too dangerous? Should we still be playing it? This is kind of the way that the game has evolved over the years. Okay, kind of moving towards the end here, let me finish up with kind of the rest of Roosevelt's story. Roosevelt is one of the youngest presidents in American history, right? He's a young president, I should say, but he's still a middle-aged man. And so that affects the way that he is an athlete. And so I want to kind of close by looking at how he wraps up his own athletic journey in the White House. And I think it's interesting to look at one of his birthdays. And so on October 27th, 1907, Theodore Roosevelt turns 49 years old. Now, is 49 old or young? Young, right? He's feeling a lot younger than I used to think, right? It depends on our perspective. Roosevelt, though, is kind of facing his mortality to a certain extent. And he finds himself in the White House, turning 49 years old, and he's alone-ish. His daughter Ethel is in the hospital for a procedure on her ear. Edith is there as well. And so he kind of wakes up to the White House by himself, and he goes to church. It's a Sunday. He comes back and he writes some letters. All right? He's always writing letters, those 155,000 or whatever we're at. A couple of them have to do with the panic of 1907, the Roosevelt panic. The economy is breaking down. But then, at the end of the day, left by himself, turning 49 years old, he's left to celebrate his birthday on his own. And that's kind of a tricky thing, right? And so what he decides to do is to go for a walk. And so he heads out of the White House about dusk, 5 o'clock or so, on this October evening. Unlike most of his walks, and I'll talk about this in just a minute, unlike most of his walks, he walks alone. He's got some security giving him a berth of protection, but he walks. And as he starts walking around the White House, he doesn't head for Rock Creek Park where he does most of his walking. Instead, he kind of stays in the city. And an hour goes by and he's still walking. The rain is getting worse. It's coming down. It's pretty much dark now. He continues walking. 2 hours, still walking. Now it's dark, it's cold, it's wet. And in Roosevelt's recounting of this, it seems like there's a switch here from I'm going to go for a walk to I'm going to show myself I can still do it. And so it rolls into hour 3 and he keeps walking. And by the time he's done more than 10 miles to celebrate his 49th birthday by himself in the rain. And he comes back to the White House and kind of declares himself satisfied. You know, I can still do it for another year. And he will tell the press as well. And so he'll kind of put this story out. And the next day you can imagine what the stories are. What an amazing president we have. He walked 10 miles in the rain and the cold. And so Roosevelt liked both parts of this. He liked the personal achievement, but he also liked the acclaim and the attention, I think, that he got for it as well. However, with that walk and with the attention, there was a related story over the couple of days, if you look through the newspaper, when he turns 49, which is not nearly as nice. The press at this juncture, for some reason I can't quite figure out, centers in on the health of the president and particularly his weight. And there is a question the day before and the day of his birthday and the day after about whether the president is really getting a double chin. This is just mean, right? And I would, there's probably a hashtag, it would be today, TR, and TR has a double chin or something, but, and Roosevelt is affected by this as well. And Roosevelt very much throughout his adult life is dealing with his weight. By the time he's in his late 40s, he is somewhere in the range of probably 210 pounds. And if we look back to his original kind of, and this is grossly unfair to compare somebody at 18 to later in life, I know. But at 18, he had been 124 pounds. So he is, like I said, almost twice the man, and struggling with his weight. And so this, too, is part of his athletic journey. And I think Roosevelt, one thing about Roosevelt, he continues to eat like a teenager long after he is a teenager. And so he's got to figure that out as well. Coffee and calories are a big part of Roosevelt's athletic story. Now, just one thing that I've kind of mentioned as well, but I want to talk about for a minute. My favorite, and one of the most important, I would argue, athletic activities of Theodore Roosevelt is walking. And not walking necessarily like we think of it, but point-to-point walks. So Roosevelt would pick a position and try to get from here to there on a straight line. And so that's just what it sounds like. He oftentimes would have someone drop him and his friends off, and they would head back as best they could through the creeks, up the rock walls, over whatever they had to, and he really enjoyed this kind of exertion. One of the most famous of these point-to-point walks, many of which included the tennis cabinet, occurred on a spring afternoon, sometime around this same age of 49 that I was mentioning just a minute ago. And Roosevelt invited two of his really favorite workout partners, the ambassador of France, Jules Jucheron, and then the assistant secretary of state, Robert Bacon. And he invited them over to the White House, and they then were dropped off out in Virginia, somewhere along the Potomac River, and then they began walking their way back. So they're walking, it starts raining, and then the rain stops, and it gets, it's kind of hot. It's got this humid kind of Washington, D.C. thing going on. And at some point, they come along the Potomac River, and Roosevelt has an idea. And he says, let's take a dip. And Jules Jucheron has realized whenever the president has an idea, he simply says, an excellent idea. He's always on board. And so Roosevelt and the ambassador of France and the assistant secretary of state strip down to their birthday suits, walk into the water of the Potomac River, and at some point, and this is somewhat apocryphal, at some point Roosevelt says to Jucheron, wait, you forgot to take your gloves off. So he's all naked except for his gloves. And Jucheron says, I can't take off my gloves. We might meet the ladies. So he's not going to do that, So, and so that is Roosevelt kind of exercising and engaging with this pursuit of sports. All right, in closing, and I know I'm out of time here. Oh, and this is the memorial to Jules Duceron in Rock Creek Park, which I stumbled upon when I was trying to do some of these walks at some point. One thing I would point out is living the strenuous life and testing yourself in terms of your limits is not easy. And if we want to do that, I would consider Jimmy Carter as a cautionary tale. Jimmy Carter took up running in the White House. This is Carter in 1979. He's 55 years old. For those of you who remember 1979, it wasn't going that well for Carter politically, but he takes up running in the midst of the jogging boom. Sports Illustrated calls him a typical born-again runner. And so he starts running, and after a little while, he's running every day, somewhere between 3 and 7 miles. He loses about 15 pounds. So it's going pretty well, and he decides to enter into a 10K in Maryland. And here you see him running well. The first mile goes pretty well. He runs about an 8:25 mile, second mile about 7:45, and then he hits a big hill. And it ceases going so well. Carter is forced to drop out of the race, and the reaction afterwards is really informative. After, you might think, what did people do? Wow, great for him for going after it. That's amazing that he gave it the try. He ran himself to exhaustion. No, none of that was said. Instead, the idea was same old Carter. Can't even finish. A couple of people said maybe he hyperventilated. And this very much becomes part of the narrative about Carter not being able to get things done. Incidentally, this was raised again not too long ago with Biden and his bike incident, which I think is kind of interesting. Okay, all of this ends up in 1917 with Theodore Roosevelt, just to kind of wrap it up here, spending a couple of weeks at a health farm in Connecticut. And for 2 weeks, Theodore Roosevelt spends his time trying to exercise and get back to being healthy as a 58-year-old. And so he gets up in the morning and he runs 3 miles, and then he does some medicine ball, and then he gets a massage and kind of rub down, and then he goes out and does another couple of miles, and then he lifts some weights, and he did this all across the whole day for 2 weeks. And at the end of the time, and this, oh, I'm sorry, this is what he said kind of coming in. You know, he felt like he needed to do something to kind of get back on track. You can see how confident he is in Cooper's ability. Here he is at the end. At the end of the time at Jack Cooper's, he invited the press in to hear about how it went. This kind of keeps up with Roosevelt, too. He both does and talks about it. This is the mayor of New York City who came out to run with him on the last day. It didn't go very well for the mayor. The mayor loses to Roosevelt in kind of an impromptu race at this training farm. Then he loses election to New York as the mayor of New York City, and then shortly thereafter he falls out of a plane in a training exercise and dies. So be careful when you compete against Roosevelt, right? Okay, so lastly, and you've been gracious to sit and listen and kind of hear some of these ideas about Roosevelt the athlete. Lastly, I want us just to think about the way that we think about Roosevelt. We have a lot of images, beautiful images around here about Roosevelt. So I want to close by looking at a few images of Roosevelt. And this is a bit more of a participatory exercise. So I'm going to, and I'll take it off. I'm going to flash up an image. And I want you just to call out what you think that image says about Roosevelt, okay? Just so we can kind of think of some of the words that we associate with Roosevelt. So let's start with this one.
Scholar.
Yeah.
Studious.
Pursuit.
Yeah.
Presidential.
Okay.
Visionary.
Sure. Yeah.
Focused.
Yeah.
Tired.
Yeah. Yeah. Politician maybe, you know, here.
Accessible.
Handy.
Yeah, right?
Brooks Brothers made that.
I know, right? So, I mean, some people might say a fraud. You know, there's some criticism. Pensive. Yeah. So we have all these images and all these ideas about Roosevelt, right? It's a famous one. Yeah. Aggressive. Decisive.
PowerPoint. He did.
Of course, this one. A lot of the way we think about Roosevelt is because of Joe and Robin, so we thank them for that. But to those ideas, I would add again this idea of Roosevelt the athlete, who started from a humble position physically, but continued to challenge himself. So I would add this image here. Look at this image. This is TR at work physically. I think he looks a bit goofy with that hat on, but he is trying, he's aging, he's pushing himself, he's not a champion, but he's continuing the struggle. And so again, this kind of brings me back to the question we started with and one I'd like you to think about going forward. What if one of Roosevelt's greatest contributions to American culture was his willingness to struggle publicly with one of his weaknesses? So thanks for your time and attention, and that's it. Come over here.
Go back to the slide of him at Cooper.
Oh, whoops. Let's see. He looks, this one?
That's fine.
Yeah.
Come on over.
Okay.
So, we don't have a lot of time.
Sorry, I went like a little on there.
It's all right. But let me ask a question, just one, and then ask the audience. So, first of all, I think you're saying that the myth that Roosevelt saved college football is a myth.
That's correct. Yes, I think it is a myth. I think it's a fine way to begin a discussion about Roosevelt being a supporter of football and being involved in that discussion. So I would imagine if a book was titled "How TR Saved Football," that's a good starter to the conversation.
Unless it's not true. Anyway, leaving that.
Yes. I think it's a bit simplistic. How about that?
This is it sounds like a simple question. I'm not sure that it is. What does Roosevelt mean by sport? We know what we mean by sport, or
Yes.
think, but I'm not sure that's what he meant.
No, I think Roosevelt means something which is competitive, whether that's with yourself or with others. For Roosevelt, sports only count if they are exhausting. And so he wants a level of violence to the games that he plays, whether that's just your body pushing yourself over this hill or that hill, or whether it's butting up against another person in a boxing ring. And so I think if you kind of keep the idea that it's competitive, it's pushing yourself, it's strenuous, to use that term, those things are fine, but he's really open then to the particulars beyond that, you know. So it doesn't matter if a ball's involved necessarily, doesn't matter these kinds of things, but it has to be exhausting.
But remember the Boone and Crockett Club, 1887. Hunting, if it's a sport, hunting, there has to be sport. That means virtue, rules, order, ethical restraint, honorability. These are key terms when he uses the word sport.
For sure. And I think in a fashion which is helpful for us here in this place, I mean, Roosevelt and the frontier and sports really fit well for him. And so I think he sees it as something that is oftentimes connected to the landscape and the wildlife in a place. So yeah, so I think that his definition of sport is more expansive perhaps than ours is today.
To that photograph, so he goes to fat camp at the Cooper, and he knows it's not going to work, and we know it's not going to work. But remember, he nearly died in South America before this. It's not as if this is just an older man. He'd used himself up in many different ways. He'd broken most of the bones in his outer frame. He'd had concussions. He'd bled ridiculously. And in South America, he came as close to death as you can come because he said, "You have to leave me here." And when Roosevelt says, "You have to leave me here," he means it. So it's pretty amazing that after all that, trying to get in shape maybe to run in 1920, he undertakes that, and we can forgive him for not bouncing back.
For sure, and I think my favorite part of his journey is this final attempt in 1917. I find it noble and inspiring, and given what he had gone through, rather amazing. And it's still TR in that he would like to tell you about how hard it was too. But yeah, I mean, he'll be dead 15 months after this, you know, and so this is a last push in some ways to challenge himself physically.
You know, what he said in that, and when he's quoting his father, "You must make your body," that famous moment. But when Simon had it up there, the last part of it was what struck me as funny. He says it's grim, hard work, that this is not something that you just do by jogging every afternoon, that this is grim determination. And you think of how much of his life was really characterized by that he once said, I'm not a brilliant man, I'm an average man, but I have a huge engine.
Yeah.
You know, I work hard at it. I've got more energy than other people, but he didn't see himself as gifted in any way, but that he had the right gumption. And for him, that kind of grim determination is a big part of his character, isn't it?
Yeah, and I don't believe him when he says he's not gifted as a scholar, as a speaker, as a writer, as a thinker.
But he meant it. He wasn't
He
just
means
playing
it,
a game.
but I think it's hard to agree with that looking in from the outside, but I do agree on the physical side of things. I think that's where he really is dealt an average to less than average hand, and he pushes. And I like the idea of engine. You know, they often talk about athletes now on this basketball team or that one. He's his engine. He just keeps running, he keeps going. That was very much Roosevelt the athlete. And I will admit, writing this book in my 40s about somebody who was in their 40s in the White House, I always think, how did he have this much energy? But he's always kind of pushing himself in those ways. So I think maybe it's the gallons of coffee, but
That won't
interesting.
do it. So one last thought here. We'd be really remiss if we didn't ask you to name a few of your favorite sports documentaries after that introduction.
That's true. Well, and again, I think sports documentaries are telling important stories about American history through sports. And so there is a 30 for 30 documentary that details the relationship between the Escobar drug family and Latin American soccer, which I think is really amazing and outstanding. And then probably my favorite as well is one that deals with the state of Alabama. It's called Roll Tide, I'm forgetting the Auburn. What's Auburn? War Eagle, sorry, Roll Tide, War Eagle. And so it it talks about that rivalry between those two schools and what that is in the state of Alabama. So a couple of my favorites.
And there's the one about I think it's the University of Alabama that refused to play in a bowl game because there were African Americans on the other team. Brilliant, 30 for 30.
Yeah, about 1970 with Bear Bryant and USC. Right. Yeah, that's a different one, but good.
Any quick question for our scholar? Yes, here.
I appreciated your book. You're writing about kind of the organization of youth sports. And we've got the trajectory during Roosevelt's time, and then we have what's today, this extreme economy of youth sports. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the trajectory during Roosevelt's time to where we are today with the organization and construction of youth sports.
Youth sports then and now.
Yeah, I mean, the idea during Roosevelt's time is to create opportunities for organized athletics through schools, primarily. I mean, that's the working idea that's beginning to expand. The idea now that those organizations are being replaced primarily by for-pay club sport opportunities, I think Roosevelt would be unhappy with that idea. One of the things that we're seeing in youth sports right now is that they're becoming more serious at a younger age, more specialized than anything we could have conceived of during Roosevelt's time. Roosevelt considers the idea of sampling and trying different things to be really important athletically, and we are just moving exactly in the other direction. One thing the Aspen Institute pointed out recently is that the average retirement age, that's not really a good term, but that's what they called it for children in sports, is now 11. And so that's the situation we've created, which is very un-Rooseveltian.
Ryan, I wish we had more time. People can get you to sign your book at 3 o'clock, but for the moment, the president has a gift for you.
Oh.
Let's say our thanks to Ryan Swanson.